let's begin. Welcome to everyone. I'm Lawrence Kermayer. I direct the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill University. And this presentation today is part of our Thursday afternoon speaker series, which occur under several rubrics, but the one that this falls under squarely is what we've called Culture, Mind, and Brain. And we have a Culture, Mind, and Brain program that's sponsored by the Foundation for Psychocultural Research based in Los Angeles. We're very thankful for their support, and it's part of what makes this speaker series possible. And in particular, this speaker series this year and at the end of last year is drawing from this recent book that came out, which itself was based on previous international conference organized by the Foundation for Psychocultural Research, trying to bring together an interdisciplinary group of scholars working in various disciplines associated with studies of culture, mind, and brain to create a forum for real dialogue and exchange and thinking through things. So we're very glad to be able to be continuing that project and building on the work that has been done. And because of this book and because of the previous work and engagement that people have had, we've had a remarkable group of international scholars to draw from for these invited talks. And I'm especially happy today to be welcoming Professor Dietrich Stout, who's a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Emory University, and who is an expert on the evolution of human cognition and toolmaking, and as you'll hear very shortly, does truly remarkable work in trying to understand, insofar as one can send a brain scanner back in time, he comes as close as one could to trying to reconstruct and recreate the emergence of complex human cognition in important cultural domains. So this is when I first heard Dietrich present some of this work, I was totally captivated by what can we say, the ability to study embodied knowledge and enacted knowledge in a way that would not at first seem possible when you think of sort of artifacts in a museum or the kinds of things that we have coming from archaeology and so on. So I'm at the same time, as you'll hear, his work really draws from the extended evolutionary synthesis in a way that really allows us to think about the central role of culture in human evolution and coevolution. So he has what he'll be talking about today is partly related to the chapter that he has in this book, but we've asked each of the presenters to say some things about their chapter and about the kinds of issues they raise, but also to feel free to explore more recent work or other dimensions that they find interesting to share. And we'll have about an hour talk somewhere in that vicinity, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterward with all of you. So I hope that we can raise some interesting issues. And so please, you can make comments or park your ideas or so in the chat area, and then we'll have a chance to come back and have more dialogue with everyone. So I'm delighted then to welcome Professor Dietrich Stout and turn the session over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Lawrence. I usually say it's a pleasure to be here. Well, it's a pleasure to speak to all of you today in any case. I look forward to talking about this sort of expansive topic. I mean, I was asked to write a chapter for this book on culture, mind, and brain and human evolution, and obviously that covers a huge territory, and so I took it as an invitation to indulge in a little bit more sort of theoretical discussion than I normally do in my publications, and I'll try to convey a little bit more theoretical discussion than I normally do in my presentations as well today. Hopefully it doesn't go off the rails too much and kind of rein me in if I go too far in any one direction, but I do think it's important to sort of think about what a big sprawling topic this is, and an inherently interdisciplinary one. So when I think of this, I kind of think of it in a classic sort of cognitive science view. At least that's what cognitive science was originally intended to be, this sort of interdisciplinary meeting place for these disparate discussions in everything from philosophy, linguistics, computer science, neuroscience, all have something to say about culture, mind, and brain. And to that, we're also adding the topic of evolution, which perhaps wasn't really stressed in this this classic formulation of cognitive science, but which, and for instance, I think they were probably thinking about cultural anthropology here, but I'm going to go ahead and add in archaeology and biological anthropology, the study of human evolution. And in neuroscience, you've got your comparative and evolutionary neuroscience, and psychology as well, comparative and developmental perspectives, all of which bring in this sort of evolutionary perspective, which to my mind is really necessary to understand anything about humans or other animals or about life in general. The classic only makes sense in the light of evolution. But an interesting thing about, appealing to this sort of interdisciplinary cognitive science framework, particularly historically, is this came out of a particular moment in intellectual history in the mid 20th century, when the innovation of information theory, people like Claude Shannon, the development of digital computers by people like Alan Turing, the theory at least, really had a huge impact on the way people thought about a whole range of things. In fact, it really recast a lot of the discussion in terms of information. And in fact, there's a little bit of discussion currently in cognitive science literature about whether cognitive science necessarily equates with this sort of formative idea that the way we talk about cognition is information manipulation. That was the original cognitive revolution, where people took what was considered to be a kind of a very ethereal, perhaps not scientific concept like mind, and said, well, no, we really can study this because this is the same thing that computers do. And I can point you to a computer, show you it's a concrete, real thing we can study. It's information processing. Well, the brain then is like a computer. It's an information processor. And this, had its impact in anthropology as well, where we started to think of culture not as a collection of things or objects or whatever, but it's information. It's stuff that's in your head. It's not necessarily behaviors, it's the shared knowledge that we have. So culture is also information. It influenced the way people think about biology, and particularly this very critical idea that in the core of all of this is that genes are essentially a code. This is literally a code in the same way that human communication is a code. It's information. And then we can redefine evolution as a change in gene frequencies. The phenotype is just the output, the reading off or translation of that code. All right, so everything is being put into these informational sort of frameworks. Now, there have been lots of critiques of that. There's been a lot of reaction to that. It's not so much that it's necessarily a completely wrong way of looking at things, but it does tend to skew your attention to certain kinds of phenomenon. And that's inherently problematic for someone like myself that wants to look at human evolution where we have physical remains. If the brain is just, it could be any kind of processor as long as it runs the right programs. If the mind is just about this symbol manipulation and you have to know the code to understand what the symbol means, then we really have no traction to relate it to physical remains of ancient skulls, ancient artifacts, anything like that. If culture is just information and it's not tethered, it's sort of this semiotic hyper reality that's not tethered to materiality, we've got nothing to work with. I mean, that's it within archaeology and human evolution. And similar critiques have been made, and obviously in psychology and the evolutionary sciences, that this is very untethered from the actual processes of how things happened. It's a bit too abstracted. And so some of the, so in essence, we have this idea coming forward that, evolution, culture, cognition, they're all about this, abstract manipulation of symbols. Well, the big problem is, how do you ground those symbols in something real, right? And so these are some of the responses that people have come up with that are very influential, that contextualize the way that I approach the topic of human evolution. The other people here, I'm sure, are more of an expert in providing like a definition of 4E cognition, but this is basically the idea that cognition isn't just about this kind of amodal symbol manipulation. It's something real that people do with their body and their mind embedded in a context, that it's an active process, not just a cognitive structure, that it's even extended in a sense that you can't really separate what I'm doing in my head from what I'm doing in interaction with the world, and that kind of. So it's embodied, it's embedded in context, it's concretely enacted, and it's extended beyond just being locked inside your head. And what the interesting thing to me is that this is really paralleled in a lot of other developments. In anthropology, people pretty rapidly moved away from the idea of culture as being just information that we share, and no, culture is something you do. It's something that's enacted. It's patterns of practice that we do. We have to actually make culture happen. Culture is both expressed by what we do, but it has a duration that then structures our potentials for action. So there's bottom up and top down interactions as well that are happening, and it's not just about thoughts and behaviors, but it's also about the physical contexts, right? The built environment that we live in shapes our culture. So all of these things go into thinking about culture as something that you actually enact. And for me, I see a real parallel as well with what Lawrence mentioned as the extended evolutionary synthesis, which once again is it's this try to move away from a very gene-centered idea that genes are these replicators, and we're just robots that move around to replicate the genes. There's more than one way to inherit information, if you want to use that metaphor of information, generation to generation. Just as we get built environments and patterns of practice, you can also have cultural inheritance here, as well as genetic inheritance. A classic example is also niche construction, in which we actually alter the environments in which our offspring and subsequent generations mature, thereby having a material ecological inheritance. And that's also an example of this other principle of reciprocal causation, that it's not just organisms responding to environments, but it's organisms altering environments in a way that they then have to react to. And so there's a reciprocal causation, a cyclical causation. And furthermore, that development isn't just the expression of a code any more than culture is a set of information that we then just act out. It's actually, the genes play a role, but so do a lot of other sources of information, so that the developmental pathways themselves become important in shaping the way that future evolution changes, so that development is itself constructive, and will help you to explore different potential adaptations. So I see a lot of connections between these different ideas, and they really contextualize the way that I think about evolution. And one way to sort of summarize it, this is maybe you can tell, an old figure from my dissertation, actually. All of these things are sort of pointing out that we're dealing with processes that are unfolding at different spatial and temporal scales, right? So that when we're talking about behavior, sure, behavior and what happens moment to moment, and physical changes are what cause over time development and learning and such forth. But also these changes that happen on a longer time scale constrain the behaviors that are possible. Similarly, it's generation after generation producing evolutionary change. But this is what then produces sort of the species typical phenotypes that constrain how development works, that constrain how behaviors work, that are instead instantiated by behaviors and instantiated by many examples of individual life history. So it's really about this interaction across levels and things unfolding at different scales. And that's what I think a lot of these critiques are trying to draw attention to, rather than moving from a sort of a simple idea that there's this code that gets communicated and expressed. One of the ironic things I think in the previous slide I pointed out, the extended evolutionary synthesis talks about inclusive inheritance, and one of the kinds of inheritance that they talk about is cultural inheritance. And what I think is ironic is as soon as they start talking about cultural inheritance, they move back to this old idea of culture as being transmitted information. And so it's almost like they've unlearned the insight that they had about biological evolution and applied it back to cultural evolution. And I hope to develop a little bit more an idea of culture and knowledge is not something that's just these bits of information or memes that are transmitted in the way people used to think that genes were central to human evolution, but actually is something a little bit more complicated than that. And in particular in this talk, I want to focus on the role of technology in human evolution. Now, obviously people are special in a lot of different ways. Humans are an interesting species in many different ways. But for me, technology is kind of fundamental and pervades a lot of these aspects of human uniqueness. And I'd like to believe I'm not just saying that because some of our best material evidence remains of past technological activities. So let me try to convince you it's not just a sort of a marriage of convenience why I would emphasize technology in human evolution. So you can take a look at this, this emblematic photo of the famous Shibuya crossing in Tokyo, right? And if you take a look at this picture, there's almost nothing you can see in this picture that is natural, right? Everything has been completely transformed by human technological activity. And I would include with that the bodies of the people that are walking across this crossing have been transformed by a long engagement with technology. Everything from, of course, there's the old argument about brain expansion and technology, but our jaws and teeth are differently shaped even than before the invention of agriculture because of developmental effects of the toughness of foods, certainly over longer evolutionary periods. The jaws and teeth have adapted to diets that are only possible with the addition of technological processing outside the body. Our hands and arms have changed or adapted to engaging in technological activities. Also with the dietary changes that happen and possibly also trade-offs with brain size, our guts have been transformed. And I won't even bother to go below the waist where you also have further changes, right? So humans thoroughly have been transformed by technology as well as transforming the environments we live in and adapt to. But the other thing I would point to is not just these people and the objects around them, but how many people are in this picture and how many people are in Tokyo and how many people are in the world. If you think about us, we are this large-bodied primate with very expensive young that take a long time to mature, right? So human women should not be able to have so many kids that we produce these billions of people on the planet. Our demographic explosion is hard to explain. And this actually predates the origins of agriculture. You can see that humans are a very highly successful large mammalian species. And so a lot of people have thought about this problem, and sort of the solution that's been proposed is that humans engage in an adaptive strategy of cooperative breeding is one way to describe it, or biocultural reproduction, in which the costs of reproduction are subsidized by assistance from other members of the community, relatives, and even others. So that it's through this alloparenting or cooperative breeding that human females are able to actually have a shorter interbirth interval and a higher total fertility rate than any other grade 8, despite having more expensive offspring. And so in order to actually have this, where you have other individuals subsidizing reproduction, they themselves have to produce some kind of surplus, right? If you're gonna have time or energy or resources to donate, you have to have more than what you just need to survive. And humans are exceptional in that we actually do this, right? For the most part, if you look at this graph, chimpanzee production and consumption, they track each other, right? A little bit, their production is a little bit below while they're still nursing, but then they pretty much track each other. Now, nobody here has got a lot of leeway for supporting somebody else's reproductive effort, right? But in humans, it's characteristic that although our kids don't produce very much at all for quite a long time, at some point, you become able to produce a lot more than you need yourself to survive. And what I would say is this is the product of technology, that is these knowledge and skills that allow individuals and groups to harvest these difficult to acquire but high return sort of resources, right? So it allows this surplus production. So what you have is what I like to describe as a human technological niche, in which technology enables enhanced productivity, material production. It's the material production that allows cooperative sharing and support, especially for the purposes of reproduction, which allows humans to have these more expensive children that take a really long time to grow, which is what allows them to develop these larger brains with longer learning periods, which is what enhances cognition and other things, which is what enables the development of further technology, and so on in a what you might describe, depending on your perspective, as a virtuous feedback cycle, right? So what I'm arguing is that technological production is a core aspect of human adaptation. And if we can understand a bit more of the evolution of technological cognition and behavior, then we've really gotten something that's very key to understanding the human species, right? So the important thing also is to think about this technological niche. That's sort of the economic argument. But technology is also something that people do in communities. So it's not just that you're producing surpluses, but you're producing an environment in which children mature, a sort of a developmental niche, right? In which they're exposed increasingly as there's this technological proliferation, more and more technological objects in their environment. They're exposed to collaboration and instruction and communication. On all of these things have an impact on the types of cognition that are going to develop, even independent of any sort of genetic change over time, right? There's a scaffolding for the development of particular kinds of cognition. This is that sort of extended, it's not just about genetic change and genetic inheritance, but it's also this inheritance of a social context and of a material context that shapes the development of cognition, right? So I sort of skirted right over what is technology, because we all know what that is, right? Except that we actually don't. People use the term technology to refer to a whole bunch of different things. B.F. Skinner talked about behavioral technology. People talk about technology of the self, and so it could mean really anything. Oftentimes, it's hard to tell the difference between technology and culture, the way people talk about it. So I just want to focus what I'm talking about and why I'm talking about a technological niche is that this material production part of it is really central. It means that technologies, for me, and the way that I want to talk about them, are things that are engaged with changing the physical environment in some way, right? They're not primarily focused on changing someone's mind, would be the distinction that I'm trying to make, which is more of a communicative goal. Now, so that's the technological systems are focused, in my sense, on changing the material environment. And that means they have particular kinds of demands. In particular, they're constrained by physics and rather than constrained by psychology, for instance. So that has interesting implications for how uniform things may be across different contexts, how they may change through time. On the other hand, I do want to emphasize that this is the focus of the system. However, it requires communication. That is, that technologies differ from simple tool use in being collaborative. They often involve lots of different people and chains of action, and those have to be coordinated institutionally and in a communicative way. And of course, they have to be socially reproduced, which involves things like teaching and learning, which are also forms of communication, as well as being forms of cooperation and collaboration. All right, so that's what I'm meaning by technology. And if you think about technology that way, in particular, if you think about for instance, the social reproduction aspect of it, you realize that it's a lot more complicated than just transmitting sort of technological information. And that is because the kinds of things that are involved in physically altering the environment and objects in useful ways involve these sorts of demands. You know, they often involve quite accurate motor skill, understanding of the physical affordances of objects and materials, increasingly complex causal relations in the physical world, a structure of tasks that may be quite extended in time and involve multiple people, and even aspects of what are the appropriate goals. So how is this going to be reproduced? How is this ability, this technological ability, going to be reproduced? You can think you have social resources that would include things like being able to just simply observe the performance of others. Also, the fact that you're in a particular physical and social context may provide you with particular kinds of opportunity for learning. I think that that's very important. More actively, other individuals, loosely teachers, can direct your attention towards important things. They can intentionally demonstrate or even provide explicit verbal or other instruction. And all of this leaves traces in the environment, right? They construct this learning niche, the products, the tools that lie around, the situations, the interpersonal relationships all provide a niche for learning. To that, you add the individual practice. Now that is something that I think I'm going to talk about quite a bit through the talk, is that these things require skilled action, and a lot of aspects of motor and perceptual skill can only be acquired through individual practice, through dedicated practice over extended periods of time. And so we think about things like what it takes for someone to do that. And again, that implicates social resources such as social motivation for practice that's not rewarding, affective feedback, assistance through difficult times, and so on. And this feeds into what you learn, and around we go in this cycle. To break up all this talking that I'm doing, let me just show you an example from New Guinea. I was there in 1999. To work with some modern stone tool makers there. And this is just a little clip. Some of you have probably seen it before. Of this guy is a novice, and he's starting to learn how to make these chipped stone tools that they later grind, these stone adzes. And as you can see, as the video starts, you know, he's just kind of really trying to just get a basic physical sense of the kind of forces and postures and everything. He's trying to embody that knowledge. But he's doing this in a social context. Here in the background, you guys always insisted on doing this. And you can see that he can't restrain themselves from reaching out and providing instructions. So you're seeing all of these things happening. Practice, implicit instruction, demonstration, pantomime, but also the social context. You heard sort of all the hubbub in the background, that this is an enjoyable thing they do together. It's related to their self-image and identity. And so this is the kind of thing where all these different aspects of human uniqueness are wrapped up in what it takes to learn a technology. Right, so I mean, it's almost like this laundry list of different things you need to have to make technology work. You've got to have this basic understanding of the physical causality and your ability to actually execute these actions. You need to be able to learn from watching others, potentially give instruction and understand instruction. I mean, if you're going to be a good teacher, you know that you need to know what other people need to know. You need to know the state of their mind, and if you're going to be a pupil, you need to understand that somebody's trying to convey information to you. So you have to this sort of theory of mind. So it seems like we need all of this stuff to get technology going, which is a bit daunting for any kind of evolutionary scenario. But going then back to this idea of the technological niche as also being a developmental niche, there's an argument based on this idea of that a lot of what our brain does is predictive processing and simulation of what's going on in the world around us. In particular, there's this argument that some of the same neural mechanisms we use to control actions, these sort of internal models we have of the world that allow us to act dexterously rather than sitting there and waiting for feedback slow. We can anticipate what's going to happen. These same internal models can be then applied to understanding the actions of others that we observe. So kind of if you have selection acting on this ability, you might get a little bit of this for free, particularly if you're developing in a developmental niche where you're surrounded by people doing interesting and important things that you want to watch. It's been argued that this ability to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes, this sort of mirroring concept is also important to the development of the theory of mind, kind of the foundation upon which that is constructed, as well as potentially being important to the development of speech and language use. This argument's been made a lot. And as well, the fact that we can't really engage in communication in speech unless you've got some degree that there's a mind out there you're trying to get in contact with, and also that we use our speech and language to teach our kids explicit theory of mind, about that people have feelings and these are what they might be, and naming emotions and all of that sort of thing. So part of the idea is that although this seems like a daunting set of abilities to evolve, they may have a common grounding that is very much related to this sort of material engagement with the world. Interestingly enough, some of the systems that are involved in perception and action control that would be fundamental to this sort of basic kind of technological action are also among the earliest developing in the brain, right? Whereas some of they're closer to the perceptual periphery, they develop earlier, they have more local connections, whereas the kind of the association cortices develop later. So what this means is that the basic perceptual and motor aspects are more likely to be genetically canalized and thus more labial to natural selection acting on kind of technical ability, whereas selection acting on those perceptual and motor capacities then alters the ability, the potential for action of the developing individual, the potential for perception, which is going to inflect the development of these later developing association areas in important ways. So we put these things together, sort of the developmental picture of what comes first, the idea that perception and action could be fundamental to the construction also of these sort of quote unquote higher psychological abilities, and put all of that also in the context of a behavioral developing technological niche. And you get what I like to call the perceptual motor hypothesis. So this is kind of where I'm at right now, and that's why there's a huge amount of text on the slide, which I apologize for, but I thought it would be easier for me to just kind of go through this. This is sort of like, since I wrote the article, this is the direction my thought has been going in. And the basic idea is that technological cognition is constructed on evolutionary and developmental timescales from ancient primate systems for body awareness engagement with the world, right? So the important thing is these systems are phylogenetically ancient and they're early developing, and they're directly engaged with both the internal and the external sensory periphery. That is, the world out there, but also our body. And so this positioning developmentally and in the scheme of connectivity makes it these regions are a nexus for interaction between externalizing processes, we're talking more evolutionary timescale of technological niche construction, where I'm altering the world, and internalizing processes where I'm developing, and my development is being influenced by this world that we've constructed. And they are also relatively heritable because they're early developing and more developmentally canalized, and therefore it's easier to see how you would get specific effects of for instance, genetic change and modification by natural selection. Whereas evolutionary change in these areas is going to alter the possibilities for action and the nature of inputs, shaping the structure and function of the more plastic and later developing association cortex, right? And so sensory motor acuity and experience are then going to guide the construction of the internal models and intuitive physics and all this that's required for technological production. And in fact, the predictions generated by these models can also in addition to controlling your own body, help to support the development of a sense of agency and self-other discrimination that underpin self-awareness, imitation, social cognition, empathy, and the development of theory of mind, all of which then plays into supporting further technological collaboration and reproduction and evolution over time. So that's kind of the big idea of what I'm pursuing right now. And of course, that's, you know, a lot of literal hand waving. So we want to think about what the evidence is that we could use to probe this hypothesis. And, you know, I like to refer to that as a domain of evolutionary neuroscience, in which we do actually have a variety of kinds of evidence that we can look at. You know, I'm an archaeologist, but I just put archaeology first because it starts with A. It's not trying to prioritize anything. But there are a variety of different things we can look at. In fact, it's the comparative evidence that most people would point to as the gold standard for evolutionary reconstruction. And that's what you've got going across the top here, where we figure out, you know, what it is that we need to explain about humans by, for instance, comparing their behavior or their cognition or their brain to other species. And what's being seen here is that one of the major things that has changed over specifically human evolution that hasn't happened as much in chimpanzees or macaques is this enhancement of this kind of dorsal frontoparietal stream of information that sometimes is referred to as the how stream, as opposed to this sort of ventral semantic what's going on stream. And by how, this means this is what integrates things like spatial awareness and models of the body with action plans on various levels and motor execution. All right, so this is the sort of how am I going to do things in the world system, and has also been linked by other people with, you know, copying actions and imitation like that, right? So I'm going to, you can see the obvious appeal here to the sort of perceptual motor hypothesis that I just articulated, that in fact this is one of the systems that has really changed over the course of human evolution. But the problem with the comparative stuff is that it only, you know, allows us to compare extant species, and humans and chimpanzees have been separated, you know, we're not sure exactly, but for quite some time. And it's during that time that just about everything that we're really, really interested in, at least I am, not everybody, I'm interested in, has happened since that split. You know, you get your language and your technology and, you know, culture, all this sort of stuff. And just the comparison can't allow us to unpick when and in what order those things sort of happened. Right, so in order to do that, we have to actually get into concrete remains from the archaeological record and the paleontological record, you know, that can put dates on things, the earliest Oldowan tools, you know, 2.6 million years ago. But just that isn't enough either, because what does that mean? And in order to understand what these ancient tools, for instance, might tell us about cognition and the evolving technological niche, we need to have analogs, and I rely very heavily on experimentation, you know, where we recreate toolmaking techniques in the lab, for instance, and other people and myself a little bit also on ethnographic analogies, like the video that I already showed you from New Guinea, to try to understand what these ancient stone tools might actually be telling us. And of course, you know, you can put these in environmental contexts, and I've already described to you why developmental information is so important as well. So the tools, you know, so take for instance, you know, the earliest well-known kind of stone tool, the Oldowan, which you know, is you basically take a rock, you hit it with another rock, you knock off sharp flakes, and they can be useful for cutting. Really became very prevalent at least by 2 million years ago, when you're also having things like larger brain and body size emerging. So what we can do is we can, you know, get somebody in the lab and do this, right? We've studied enough of these artifacts that we have some idea of how it was done. So just to give you an example, here's Bruce Bradley doing a simple, he's taking a chunk of flint and he's going to knock off some sharp flakes that could be used. So that would be an excellent knife right there that he just knocked off. And what you need to pay attention to in this is a couple things. One of them is, you know, I'd like you to focus on the left hand in particular, and even the way he's positioning his fingers to brace and support, and the rotation of this core, and there's a lot of very precise manipulation that's very subtle that would be hard for you to appreciate without trying your hand at it, so to speak. Of course, the precise action of the delivery of just the right amount of force for the size of the flake that's going to come on, so that you don't shatter it, but you do break it, is also very important. So this is a very demanding skill. On the other hand, there is not a lot of planning. For instance, you strike one flake and then he just looks around. Where is another place that's going to work? Okay, I'll get a flake off there. And there's not like, he doesn't like set up that, in 3 flakes, this is going to be a great place to go. It's just, sort of living in the moment kind of thing. Right. And so the approach, then we have people do this and we use various ways to get brain activation data from them. I won't go into, we can talk about it later if you want to. But here's one from, FDG PET study that we did early on. And just point out that, maybe this isn't too surprising, but it's at least validating that in modern humans anyway, the areas that are particularly stressed or called upon for this basic kind of skill map pretty well onto the system that I was talking about before, of areas that are enhanced in humans versus chimpanzees for spatial and kinematic understanding and relating that to action goals, right? And so you see very much similar there, which is somewhat validating. You could flash forward then to about 500,000 years ago, a much more sophisticated or complicated kind of tool, this Acheulean Handaxe from the site of Boxgrove. These things, the trick here is that you start with these big amorphous sort of nodules, and you have to reduce this oddly shaped thing. In particular, you've got to make it nice and thin in cross section, right? And that's one of the hardest things to do. And one of the reasons that that's hard is in order to thin down the cross section, you have to strike these flakes that pass the midline, right? If they don't go more than halfway across, you're not going to thin down the middle. So in order to reliably strike this long, thin flake that's going to come off just the way you want it, you have to do things like preparing the platform beforehand, the adjusting the bevel and position of the midline, doing these things that we call platform preparation. So it's much more nested in planning intensive sort of thing. And if you were to kind of graph out how these sequences are different. In the older one, you've got the same thing over and over again, hit it, rotate it, blah, blah, blah. Whereas there's a lot more, multi-level contingency in planning and executing Acheulean stone toolmaking. So here's Bruce again, just to give you a quick impression. Already you can see that he's not just going to start whacking away at the rock. There's a bit of planning that's going on. He's thinking, how am I going to turn this? Where is the Handaxe inside of this piece of rock? And so what he's doing initially, you say, like, well, clearly he wants to get rid of all of this out here. Why is he striking little flakes down there when obviously this is what needs to go? And what he's doing is that platform preparation. What he's done is he's removed some flakes that are going to alter the angle of that edge that he had there and establish, a good striking platform so that when he does hit it, a nice long flake comes off the area he wants to remove. You can see again where he's done a lot of modification to that edge before going for his bigger hammerstone here, where he's going to now strike it off and then it comes off in the way that he had intended. Archaeologists sometimes call these Handaxes bifaces, and that just means because they're worked on 2 faces. And a characteristic thing that people do is this, it's back and forth, sort of almost like stitching, back and forth one side and the other to create a centered edge with the right kind of angles that you need to exploit it. So all he's doing there is trying to extend that edge around that has the right angle, a little brushing stuff to remove some irregularities and create just the right platform. And boom, when it comes off, it's this long, thin blade-like flake. Here he's noticed that there's a particular problem area. It still has a bunch of this chalk there, and the angles aren't quite right. So he's trying to figure out how he's going to create the angle that he needs in order to remove that. And he's going to back off. I'll go back to an area that I already have more under control and work my way in. Nip off just a few millimeters of stone here is going to be enough to change the angle enough that I can get that off the way that I wanted to. Right. And so I just, fast forward to the end. I think it took him about 12 minutes to do that. But the point being that the demand for planning is there, but also demand for precision. Like, whereas in the older one, if you strike a flake, you don't really care if it's, 50 millimeters long or 55 millimeters long. But when you're making a Schulian Handaxe, stuff like that can sometimes mess you up, right? You move too much and the whole thing is messed. So you have to be planned, but also very accurate in your motor control. And so we take we compare the Handaxe making to the older one, and you see, as you might expect, that you get more sort of frontal activation. In particular, the right inferior frontal gyrus. In fact, the white matter connections to this area become enhanced when you train to make Handaxes. It becomes active when you're watching Handaxe making or when you're doing it. And we would relate this, in particular, this frontal activation, to the more complex strategizing that I've been talking about. In fact, we have a paper that's currently only available as on bioRxiv as a preprint, but we were able to model the difference in the structural complexity of Oldowan and Schulian sequences, and actually use that number, that specific quantification of structural complexity to point out this is the right inferior gyrus specifically responds to the structural complexity of tool making that you're watching, the sequences. And we've done some of the comparative work with Aaron Hecht here. And not only is this an important region functionally, but it is one of the regions that has changed very significantly over human evolution, particularly this extension, more anterior, much larger extension to the right inferior frontal gyrus from this parietal connectivity. So very interestingly, these evolutionary changes in this human white matter connectivity, the frontal parietal system, parallel the effects of stone tool making training, which raises this very interesting question for us of whether this is a species typical difference that has sort of genetically evolved, or whether it's a reflection of growing up in a technological niche, or a little bit of both. And that's something we'd like to look into further. The other interesting thing about this system, this connection to the inferior frontal gyrus, that seems like it's just off the wall, that I'm now showing you mirror self-recognition in a chimpanzee. This is a test that's given to animals to see if they can recognize themselves. Basically, that if you react to the object and the individual in the mirror as another individual, maybe you don't understand it, but if you see that that's yourself, it clearly means you have an understanding of yourself as an individual. This is self-awareness, and in particular, what you need to do to establish that connection is to make a mapping between the motions that you see in the mirror and the motions that you're planning and executing yourself, and see that that I am controlling those actions. All right, so it's this internal modeling stuff that I was talking about before, and interestingly enough, this ability to be self-aware enough to recognize yourself in a mirror among chimpanzees, it's variable, and it correlates with how human-like your extensions to the right inferior frontal gyrus are. So if you have more human-like extensions, you're more likely to be able to recognize yourself in the mirror. Right? Which plays in, this is an example of how these things might interlock with each other, whereas you evolve something for one reason, but it's also good for something else, particularly when you place it in a developmental niche of an evolving technological system. And I think it would be very interesting, in future people are doing increasing amounts of work on the relationship between inter-individual synchrony and neural alignment and the effectiveness of learning and teaching. And I think it would be really great, hopefully in the future, to do some work like this with stone tool making. But for now, I'll try to hopefully go through this fairly quickly. Mainly what I've actually published since I wrote the chapter have been a couple studies coming out of this project that we did, where we trained people to make stone Handaxes for about 90 hours of training. Was by an expert flint napper, Nada Krisha. Justin Pargeter was involved in lithic analysis as well. And our goal was just to maximally train these people, try to get them as skilled as possible in 90 hours, and to record and understand that learning process. So we published one thing right away, just this basic report on the learning curve that we observed. But in order to do that, we had to solve a number of technical issues. So for one thing, if you want to say participant 1 learned more by hour 50 than participant 2, you have to actually be able to quantify their learning and their skill, right? So here are some of the Handaxes and things that aren't Handaxes that they made during the project. And an archaeologist can tell you, oh, this one certainly looks, this one and this one look pretty good. That looks horrible. But put a number on that, right? Something objective. How are you going to do that? It's not easy. So what we did was we actually had the instructor give them a skill assessment every 10 hours in which they make a Handaxe. She watched them. She used a formal rubric that she had developed on the things that she was trying to teach them and observing whether they were doing them and rating them and giving them a score. And so that was one approach, which gives you, a score from the instructor. However, it's obviously very, subjective, and furthermore, it requires you to be able to observe the individual, which is something we don't have in the archaeology. So what we wanted to do is get a score that came directly from the object that they produced, which is something you would have. So we measured this in a whole lot of different ways, as archaeologists do, and we fed that into a machine learning algorithm, a random forest regression, and we came up with a model that goes from the artifact to actually predict the score the instructor would have given it, and achieved what we thought was some pretty good reliability there. So we moved over completely to this totally objective and continuous artifact-based score, and that allows you to generate what we have here, which is the Handaxe learning curve. And the thing I'll point out here is this is a classic, quote unquote, power law learning curve. Whatever, you've probably had this experience where initially you improve fairly rapidly because you start really bad, but then further gains become harder and harder to come by over time. And generally this is related to, this is explained in terms of kind of the effects of chunking, to where you're consolidating different aspects of perception and an action into useful chunks, but the more you chunk things, the less there is to gain through further chunking and so forth. And that's what gives you this curve. Interestingly, there's also a lot of variability in how people were doing over time, and we wanted to understand that. We gave them a bunch of tests and whatever. I'll just talk about one that appears how you do after your first 20 hours of practice is correlated with how well you do at a card sorting task. Maybe you've seen these kind of things. You're supposed to choose. You're supposed to match this one to one of these. But you don't know whether you're supposed to match on number, shape, or color, and the rule keeps changing, and you have to shift from rules flexibly. And when you get set shifting, is generally associated with a set of brain regions that you may now be familiar to you, and that are also implicated in our studies of stone toolmaking. Right? So in particular, this idea that it might be involved in early stages of chunk-based learning, I think is a very interesting thing that we're further pursuing. After that sort of initial bump, what pays off is practice. So the variability that you see here has to do with especially how clustered the practice of individuals. Where we try to control this, but people live in a real world where they can't always make it for the I can't remember off the top of my head, several hours a week that they're supposed to do, and maybe they try to make it up by doing it the next week, and we just have to live with that. It gives us the variation that you see here, which it wasn't what we were aiming for, but it actually was very interesting because we found that performance over here was correlated with the density of practice. Right. So initially you have sort of these cognitive factors here, but then it's about dedicated practice. And of course that's interesting because in a natural environment, what is going to be conducive to practice is social structures and social support that encourage that kind of behavior and the ability to do that. The other thing that's important is that we were able to train them for like 90 hours, but this scale goes all the way up to 5. It's not even on here, and 5 being what our modern expert nappers do, and they never got anywhere near there. So we were able to extrapolate that across individuals, it would have taken anywhere from 121 to 441 hours to get to sort of expert level. And so you can think about that also in terms of investments in learning and kind of social support that might imply. And this is when you're given hands-on, full-on, instruction. And not asked to kind of go it on your own. The other thing that we've done is we wanted to tease apart exactly what it was that they were learning that was letting them get better. In particular, in archaeology anyway, there's a lot of, it's conventional to talk about knowledge versus know-how in stone tool making, which sort of loosely maps onto things like procedural versus declarative, or cognitive versus motor skills, that kind of thing. From our perspective, what's really interesting is the intersection of these is what's required to have skill at a technological task. The conventional wisdom is that, in fact, knowledge is acquired more easily than know-how, and that might not surprise you too much. So when people want to, for instance, do an exercise with a class in which they teach them a kind of stone tool making, they'll have them just carve a potato following, the strategy, but without the demands for actually being able to break stone in the way you want it to break, that are the real challenge in learning to make stone tools. And when people want to do these transmission chain experiments of cultural learning of shapes, and they have them carve foam or something like that, because otherwise they never get anywhere, because it's hard to acquire that perceptual motor know-how. That's the fundamental challenge in stone tool making, not so much the strategy. We tried to get at this early on by having people in the scanner, looking at rotating hand axes, and they were asked to make decisions about whether that was, a strategically good thing to do, and whether the prediction was actually physically correct as to what would happen. We found, as you might, that people could learn what the strategy was pretty quick, but they remained pretty much just rubbish at actually evaluating what would actually happen in terms of, whether that's a correct prediction or not. So again, these sort of the perceptual motor skill, harder to develop. But there's a lot of reasons why that's not very similar to the real world. So we wanted to, in this study, do something a little bit more concrete. And so we adopted a paradigm from Blondine Brill's lab, in which you give people a piece of stone and a Sharpie, and you say, like, well, mark where you're going to hit it and what's going to happen. And in their studies, they found that only their much more experienced individuals were able to actually accurately predict what was going to happen when you straighten, and that the others couldn't at all. And so they said, well, the fundamental thing that develops is your understanding of how stone breaks, and that can only be acquired through experience. But there were some issues. This is still a bit of an artificial paradigm. And there's more than one reason why your prediction might fail, including the fact that your prediction might have been accurate, but you hit it in the wrong place. You missed, right? So we wanted to think about some of those things as well. So in our study, we gave people a rock, as we did in any other condition, asked them to start making a hand axe. But for the first 5 blows, they're supposed to predict what was going to happen using the Sharpie. And then we could, measure the deviation and so forth. They were allowed to strike it 3 times. And if nothing came off by the 3rd, it's called a fail on that flake removal, and they had to move on to something else. So interestingly enough, this sort of learning curve this is, the percent of flakes in which they managed to get something off in 3 blows. It parallels, it's very suggestive of the way it parallels this learning curve that is based on the hand axe quality. This is a different task, the successful flake production. And you see it's very similar. And again, they don't get to the same level as the experts in either one. But it actually is correlated significantly. I know it's because there are kind of sparse number of options for number of flakes there. It doesn't look that impressive, but this is a significant reliable relationship between your ability to make hand axes and, in a different time, a different rock, the number of successful flakes that you're able to get off. So flaking success seems to be really important to the hand axe, not some sort of like abstract knowledge. It's just about, can you get flakes off? And in fact, it's not really that they're making inaccurate predictions either. The relationship between a prediction and the flake, the experts are a little bit better, but maybe not so much to get excited about. So it's not really that it seems to be that these novices, and these are people that just haven't had any experience at all, are making unrealistic predictions. The problem I mentioned before, of course, is that's based on the flakes that actually came off. right? So, that could be maybe they just missed, or, or whatever, and flakes that didn't come off. This is based on the predictions that they made. So we can ask the question, not, what were the flakes they made, but were the predictions they made, did they adhere to known fracture mechanical principles of stone, which have to do with things with the relationship between how far from the edge you hit it, what this angle is going to determine how long the flake is. And we can see again that there's really, the experts are, predicting somewhat larger flakes, but really the appreciation of the nature of this relationship, these slopes of these lines are really not significantly different. So it doesn't seem that, even not given any prior working experience with stone, people are making reasonable kinds of predictions about how it would break. Instead, what's really going on is they just can't hit what they're aiming at. It's that simple. I mean, what really changes over time is your ability to actually hit the predicted impact point versus not. So it's that fundamental aspect of perceptual motor control that's driving all of this, not some sort of more elaborate strategic kind of understanding. And in fact, this bears out that, in fact, there is a significant relationship between your typical error and the quality of the Handaxe, so that if you tend to miss what you're aiming for, this is broken out by platform depth, because you need to hit it harder, basically, when you hit it further in, for a number of reasons. But it's especially true when you're trying to take off the big flakes that you need to make a thin Handaxe. The more your error is, the less good the Handaxe you produce is, on a separate trial. So it's your motor accuracy, perceptual motor accuracy. But not to say that it's not about strategy either. I want to say these things can't be pulled apart, because what we saw that the novices were actually doing is that they would adjust their strategy to accommodate the fact that they know they can't hit what they're aiming at. I just mentioned that the thicker the platform, the bigger the flake, but the more force you have to deliver to get that nice big flake off, which is in fact what you have to do to make a nice Handaxe, these big invasive flakes. And that's what experts do. They combine a very steep platform angle with a very thick platform, and that makes the big, thin flake that you want. The novices, they start off, and during this, initial period of learning, they're realizing that they need to strike, more obtuse angles, right? But they also are now having the experience where it's harder to get those flakes off, so they're making the platforms thinner, right? So they're making the perceptual motor task easier for themselves through their selection and their strategies. Unfortunately, that's antithetical to high-level expertise. You can kind of muddle through that way, and that's why what we see here is we've got this, this flat, area of little improvement, because they're not able to make the leap to the appropriate strategy, and they're sort of constrained. They're accommodating their own lack of perceptual motor ability in the strategies that they're pursuing. So the point of all of this, I hope, to sort of kind of sum it up, is that the skill reproduction is not the same thing as just some kind of information transmission. I've now given you a bit of a lecture about Handaxes, and of course you wouldn't go out and try to make one now. So it's not just something you communicate, it's something that has to be reproduced. And that means that you have to reproduce complex structures of action that have multiple levels. And it's kind of when people in the cultural, evolutionary, and comparative psychology literature try to make a big distinction about whether you're imitating the actual means or just copying the end result. I say, well, what are you talking about? Because what's a means and what's an end depends on what level of description you're using, and all of these need to be articulated, which means you have to go through this very lengthy, sort of helical learning process of practicing, observing, getting feedback in order to develop all aspects of this. And finally, that understanding and execution are completely interdependent, right? So that what I know depends on what I'm able to do, and how I interpret what I'm able to do depends on what I know. And this is what we call skill. Right, so hopefully those are just some examples and the bigger theoretical framework, and that by pursuing a theoretically informed but empirically specific research program, we may be able to hopefully start filling in some more of these events in human evolution. So thank you very much for bearing with me through the kind of long presentation.
Thank you so much, Dietrich. It's, as usual, really fascinating, both for the specificity and the intricacy of seeing this kind of technology up close and how, what it entails, and then this very broad implication about, how human beings learn to do complicated things that allow them to survive. I have a couple of questions or comments, and then maybe we'll throw it open to everyone here. So I encourage you all to sort of get your questions organized. I guess I'll start with the last thing, which is really this idea that somehow you can get stuck in as a beginner, you can get stuck in a naive or simple approach to things based on the limited amount that you know, and maybe plateau. And maybe we don't know if they would ever actually get to the expert level if there wasn't an expert who came along and said, here's another way to do it, or let's be more systematic about it, or, it really takes twice as much time to do it, so don't be in such a rush, or, give some kind of meta instruction, in other words. And it makes me think of this paper that Joshua Bengio, a computational scientist who wrote about the value of culture, with the idea that, and it goes back to this predictive processing thing, if we're trying to optimize our understanding of a local situation, we can find a local minimum or maximum, but it might not be the best one. There might be another one sort of over there on the landscape of possibilities. There might be another one over there, but we're never going to get there because we're kind of in a well. And we would have to do a lot of things that are counterintuitive, or that even seem like backward steps or risky steps or whatever. And so we rely on there's somebody being in that other valley, in effect, and saying, that's the expert or the explorer or whatever, who says, there's another way to do it. And you may have to, go through some counterintuitive thing here, or something that requires expertise. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or any sense of, this is obviously a difficult thing to study, but I mean, one simple way of framing again is what's the difference between what the kind of knowledge that the expert has that maybe is not really just an incremental thing vis-a-vis what anybody begins to acquire by just starting to practice.
Yeah, I mean, Wayne Gray has a nice paper about this called it's like plateaus, leaps, and dips, or something like that in learning. And that curve that I show. I mean, what you often get actually is people are getting better and they reach a local plateau. And the example I think of is typing. I'm actually still kind of a hunt and peck sort of person, but you can get so far that way, and actually you'll get better faster. If your goal is just to write like a 500-word essay, and whoever gets done first, you better to do that than to try to learn to touch type first. But you reach a plateau, right? And then you eventually, if you want to read, if there is an expert out there that can tell you that there's a better way, you're going to get slower. There's going to be a dip before you take off again, And I think that that's exactly what is going on in the Handaxe experiment that we did, where people, they cut corners and they try to get to the bare minimum what they could do to, kind of make something that sort of looks like a Handaxe, because, it's very unrewarding to keep going around it. It's not looking anything like what you want. But they were going to have to make a real transition to ever get up to the expert level, and without somebody to tell you, what that is, and to encourage you that, yeah, even though it's getting worse now, it's going to get better if you do that. That sort of thing is hard to achieve. So it ties up both the information and the model and the motivation and all of those things. And I'm sure that people who are in sports and do coaching would talk about you have to educate people about bad habits that they've developed that, sort of like we're good at the outset, but are holding them back from, expert performance and that kind of thing. I don't do that, so I don't have concrete examples. But I'm sure I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, I've had a small experience, not of the expert part, but of the importance of some kind of meaningful feedback trying to learn piano as an adult with a less than malleable brain. But with this program that gives me feedback when I try to play something. And so, whereas I subjectively feeling like I'm getting nowhere, it's telling me, oh, you just improved by 3%. So, I mean, that's actually helpful, because then I feel like it doesn't feel like I'm getting anywhere, but it looks like I am getting closer. So I'll persist and I'll keep practicing and I'll keep trying. And at the same time as I have, I can tell which trial got me closer, which trial didn't. But there's something, I mean, that's really taught me something very important, because I realized that I can't perceive small gradations of improvement at all. That's what this program is doing, and presumably that's maybe what an expert teacher could do. Maybe it's also suggests that teaching itself is something a little bit different than being able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge thing. Like, there's not a whole ton of people that are studying, people learning to make stone tools and so forth. But in a lot of the cultural transmission literature and the chain stuff, they'll manipulate like teaching versus not teaching conditions, and then they draw broad conclusions. But like the teachers are very variable in how effective they are, and we actually don't have any, data driven, like what's an effective way to teach stone tool making. We just have people that have been doing it for decades. So it's, oh, this works, or this doesn't work. But it's another variable that we're going to have to deal with if we want to really generalize our results in any way.
So I remember years ago, Lynn Hunt, who was an anthropologist studying Inuit learning stone carving, and particularly children learning from more experienced carvers, where there was very little verbal interaction, unlike the video clip you showed, which was so animated and there's so much going on there. But it was close observation by the expert of the naive person, and then them changing slightly what they were doing as a way of sort of trying to give some more guidance or a physical model that could be integrated. So anyway, just to say, it's interesting, different style of teaching in effect than our,
Yeah, I mean, the language is good for some things, and for others, you really have to, it's really body position and that sort of stuff. It's much more effective to like, reach in and that's what I often have to do or feel that I have to do when I'm trying to teach people to nap stone, because you can tell them a million times, rotate it, whatever, but they just don't, they don't quite get it. Yeah.
This is a little further afield here, but I wanted to ask you just about other kinds of technologies. I understand, this is driven by the fact that, stone artifacts endure, so that there's stuff to go and look at. But are there other things that can be studied, this way, other kinds of technologies that might have some either archaeological trace or maybe a more recent, human history could be studied from the same angle, kind of, with the idea behind it that given the way you've defined technology, there are probably many kinds of learning, many kinds of skills, maybe different parts of the brain that are involved, different kinds of communicative strategies, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's, it's the danger or the hazard of using a term like technology and technological cognition, is people are going to start to think it's somehow a uniform. But yeah, across different goals and different techniques, different kinds of teaching, learning strategies, and different. So it can be a lot of diversity. I think the sort of the perceptual motor hypothesis in an attempt to think about what could still be some sort of conceptual unity to something that's going to have very different end products. But certainly, in order to deal with it or test it in any way, we'd have to look at that diversity and see if the attempt at unity really holds up. And so there are a lot of other technologies that are obviously very important and very interesting. I will make just the little pitch that the stone tool thing isn't entirely just the pragmatics of what's preserved, and that in the Stone Age, stone is called Stone Age. That's the hardest material that they work, right? That is, and working that material has certain demands that other materials don't have. Some of that motor precision and controlled fracture is really a unique kind of a demand, and it provides the cutting edges that you need to do a lot of the other technology. So it is, in some ways, a fundamental foundational technology. But I'm a lithic technologist, so of course I'm going to say that. There are a lot of other interesting things that we'd like to be able to look at, and they are sort of incrementally harder to look at in the archaeology because of preservation issues. One that I haven't dealt with that I would love to see, but it's just the issue of what you use the stone tools for, especially the butchery. Of course, they're going to be used on wood and all kinds of other things, but we do have a lot of fossilized bone with cut marks. So understanding really in the way that I've approached stone tool making skill, butchery skills and collaboration and processing techniques is something, that could and should be done. Hunting, people are still arguing, is this hunting, is this scavenging, what kind of hunting? So the facts of the matter are still in dispute in a lot of cases. So it's hard to get to that next level of, well, what does it mean that they were hunting in this way? But that would be, really a very different kind of skill that would, I would certainly expect involve some kinds of, it's a different temporal scale for one thing, and so that would be very interesting to complement this. Of course, things that are made in other materials don't have this, stone tool making is always subtractive, but when you're making multi-component hafted tools, or some work has been done on making the adhesives that people use in making those tools, and the the formulas for different, basically they're doing chemistry, so you can look at that. And so there's a number, even the heat treating of stone. So there are a wide range of things that can be done, and I would like to see done. I've committed myself to the stone tool making because I will say that for someone to take on these technologies, you can't just sort of make a foray into them. I mean, you gotta it's like, okay, I really need to understand this, do it myself, sink yourself into it if you're going to make a real attempt at it. But I hope that other people will do that, because it's certainly very important.
Yeah, one of the other things that occurred to me in thinking about this, watching this now, was also the idea that there are other domains of life. You mentioned that tools are used in many domains. There may be other kinds of technologies. People might be at the same time making things out of plant fibers, let's say clothes or receptacles or something, and those are going to be largely lost. And there may be a gender component to that too, in that might be women's work. I mean, if we draw from contemporary societies and how people divide up different tasks that are, men out hunting and women in the domestic sphere, to the extent that that's, more common than other patterns. So I that brings me to the final, I guess, comment or reflection, is whether the contemporary ethnography of people who are still using these kinds of technologies and how their societies work and how those particular skills, the time involved, the people who do them, the role that they play, and their relationship to other things, whether that offers any potential insights about the parallels between these, this kind of learning and technology and other things, or is there anything to be learned from that contemporary, acknowledging the contemporary situation is not really, a stepping stone on the evolutionary thing. It's just a way to get hints and clues about it, but still, does it sort of point to something about a kind of ecology of knowledge and skills that one could think about?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a sort of a symmetry problem in that, the great thing to know about for the archaeology is the stone tools, because we have, probably billions of them. I don't know, but there's a lot of evidence, but that's the thing that not many people are currently doing in a traditional context for you to study. So there's one group that I worked with in New Guinea, and that was already 20 years ago, and I don't know what's going on there now. There's some hide workers in southern Ethiopia. It's a very different kind of technology. There are people that nap stone beads, which is, again, really different kind of technology, but at least it's stone fracture, that Blandine Brill and Valentine Roux have studied in India. But you put all that together and you don't have really a framework for saying something, So you have different groups, a couple miles down the road from each other in Ethiopia. Here it's, it's men's work, here it's women's work, So as far as that goes, we got nothing, but, you could look at other technologies, and have a much broader sample, but then you have less ability to relate it to the deep archaeological record anyway. So Yeah, there's some real challenges, but what you were saying, like I did find, working in New Guinea, like I wouldn't generalize, so that was men there very much. That was, men's, and I certainly wouldn't generalize that to any prehistoric situation that I didn't otherwise know about. But some of the stuff that they do that's closer to this, what it takes to work with stone. This is what I was referring to earlier on when I was saying, the fact that it's material production, constrains things in certain ways, and no matter what your cultural context, you got to deal with the fact that stone breaks a certain way, and as you get closer to that, some of the, the kind of terminology that they had was very similar to, the kind of terminology, the things they needed to talk about were similar to the things that archaeologists need to talk about when you talk about stone technology, because that's what matters when you try to break stone, kind of thing. So I think some of that, some of the learning demands, some of those things are maybe more generalizable than the broader social context is likely to be.
So that could lead ultimately to a way when you understand better what are these skills and how are they learned and how are they instantiated in the brain, you could generalize from that and say, okay, so this is a certain kind of procedural learning with certain kind of constraints. Now let's think of some modern analogies to this and see if they show some of the same learning curves or some of the same kinds of,
Yeah,
changes.
and that's what the next step for this sort of perceptual motor idea would be like, well, how generalizable is this? Like, well, is stone mapping in a lot of ways like wood carving, or these other sort of, things you might expect it to be similar? Is it actually also similar to computer programming? Well, in what sense? Are there any ways in which there are similarities or similar systems involved? That would be the sort of adventurous kind of hypothesis, or you might compare it to learning surgery or something like that, where the similarities and differences in the way these skills are acquired. I think that's what's really interesting.
Where you could quantitate it by saying, so there's certain kinds of very physical skills that require fine motor control, require whatever, certain perceptual links, but there's also like, how many steps ahead do you have to think?
Yeah.
Like, a chess player thinking 3 steps ahead or 12 steps ahead. I mean, clearly there's going to be something different going on in how we organize such complicated chains or whatever. So.
Yeah, we think so. Although the exciting thing would be if they're less different than we think they are. That's sort of what
Maybe it's just, yeah.
I read a paper recently. It was very depressing, talking about the generalizability crisis in psychology. One of the suggestions was to make really adventurous hypotheses that are quite likely to fail. So I know it's let's predict that these are all the same. Just move that. But
okay, any questions or comments from other people? I suspect that this is a little bit outside some people's, some people are encountering this for the first time, so that may inhibit people's questions. Also helps if everybody's hiding behind their name, so we need you to
yeah, well, I mean, there is sort of a Zoom dynamic,
Yes, I know.
A little bit more comfortable with the silence than they are in a room whenever
I know, and you get lulled into it over a period of time where it's kind of shake yourself out of it. So, yeah. Okay, well, there are a couple of people who, here's somebody. Okay, here's something. I'm wondering if there's research that was made studying the impact of the learning niche environment on the learning process. What helps, what doesn't, since watching is such an important part of learning a new technology. I'm wondering if watching people that don't look like you might negatively affect the learning process. For example, being the only woman in a learning niche of men experts.
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't begun to tackle that kind of level. We're just scraping around trying to get a bunch of people to be willing to try to learn Handaxes for a few months at a time, and take who is available. But I think there is a lot of work in psychology and developmental psychology that would suggest that we would expect that to be the case. And this is like, Lawrence and I were talking earlier about variation in teaching strategies. And I would see that that's also like a part of it, is it going to be impacted by extra experimental like power dynamics? Like, you're coming to my lab and I'm a professor and I'm going to teach you this thing and I'm a white male and you're not. And like, all sorts of, it's hard to know. And that's going to be very different from, I'm learning from my mother in a small scale society, so I think we do have a big generalizability problem for any sort of more specific conclusions that we're making. Right now, we're trying to sort of map out some kind of some baseline basics, like, well, we just, this is the low-hanging fruit, let's do it. And hopefully we can, run similar experiments under different conditions. I would love to do this in the field, for instance, in a sort of a non-Western setting, a non-academic setting. I will say that I was a bit struck, and perhaps it's because of the thing that you're talking about, that we did a pilot experiment recently, in which we manipulated learning conditions, and in one of them, I was teaching people, and another, I just gave them the opportunity to watch what I was doing, and they all pretty much ignored what I was doing, which was really bizarre to me, because I'm sort of like, this is the guy that designed the experiment and set the whole thing up, is supposed to be the expert about it, and but they didn't. So I don't know if they just didn't connect with me in another way because of social reasons, or if this is something else. But we're going to have to deal with those sorts of questions if we want to know that.
That's very interesting. It makes me think of a totally different scenario. At one point in learning psychotherapy, we had a continuous case seminar in which we watched videos of this, therapy where, experienced clinician and patient are talking, and then later we had to produce our own videos of our own sessions. And in watching some of my colleagues at this point, some of them adopted the same physical posture, like steepling of fingers and things that the teacher had done, which were not only irrelevant, but maybe not even a good idea in terms of, like your stance toward another person. But, and I don't, it was totally unconscious. It was just kind of mirroring and this mimicry. So anyway, I think that's interesting in terms of what is conducive to us mimicking certain bodily things for better or for worse, and what are the social dynamics of that make us do that?
Yeah, I mean, the cultural evolution people got very excited about the sort of over imitation phenomenon, which is what you're talking about, where we just sort of copy things that are irrelevant. But I think it was later found to be a bit vulnerable to manipulation. It's like under certain circumstances people will do this, and under certain circumstances they won't. And so there's a whole big realm. The real interest is, why do people do it sometimes and not others? Yeah. So I mean, and that's a huge question. We're going to have to try to relate specific variation in teaching behavior to outcomes. I think, so what is in fact effective, and so I've talked to Bruce Bradley. I showed the video a couple of times. He says, well, what you want to do is you want to give them a little piece of something, little information. This is what you're supposed to do. Then they just have to practice. And then you can tell when they're ready, when they sort of mastered that level. You can go ahead and just give them a little nudge in a different direction. It's like a staircase, right? And that's his strategy. He thinks that works quite well. Other people might find it a different thing. I don't. He also had this approach where one of the sort of know-how aspects that's very difficult for people is to get the sort of the right angle of the core and hit it with the right amount of force, including not too much. Brill found that people typically, because they're having trouble, they hit way too hard, which also makes them less accurate, because the more you try to hit it really hard, the harder it is to hit what you're aiming for, and it's sort of counterproductive. And they have to realize the right amount. And what he would do as an exercise, it wasn't actually even napping at all. You just hold the rock, and you drop the rock, and you show them that if they have all the angles right, just the weight of the rock will take the flake off, right? And so he felt this was a very important, and effective pedagogical device. I don't know. And to make it even more interesting is, it probably works better for some people than others. One of the things that pilot study that I mentioned, we found a lot of variability in how different individuals would react to a particular teaching condition. And so like for instance, if you're somebody that tends to pay a lot of attention to social information, you benefit more in a condition where you're not being taught, because you actually learn socially anyway, right? Whereas that doesn't matter if you're being taught, because it's kind of being forced on you. So yeah, there's really a lot of complexity in what you're talking about and figuring out if there are different effective ways to scaffold the learning of the perceptual motor stuff, and how important it is to provide sort of the knowledge. A lot of us as Western, scientists and whatever will approach this by almost like we give them the whole lecture about how stone breaks and the fracture mechanics and the importance of everything at the outset, and then we try to, does that help them? I don't know. So that's the kind of thing I think would be very interesting to figure out.
The skill teachers, you're implying, Jill, the skill teacher can also link the sort of nonverbal part to we call this so and so, like you pointed out that in the ethnographic example, that people have developed a vocabulary that maps quite well onto the vocabulary that archaeologists develop when they're trying to say what's going on with this stone technology. So both kinds of knowledge are available, therefore, to the expert in some ways, and they can make the links. And the question is, when is that actually a viable shortcut or useful addendum to the just
yeah, we don't yet know. I mean, they're sort of anchoring concepts using words. Maybe that helps. There's disagreement, scientific disagreement about whether this is all due to sort of, subtle grain of sand feedback effects, what like Lawrence is talking about. Maybe you just get a little bit more, and you practice more and you get better, or whether there really is something, different in the way, for instance, your basic perceptual motor cortex is wired. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to ultimately get at. When we do these studies, we do collect structural imaging as well as functional imaging data on people that are learning. And so we're trying to, we did in the study that I was talking about, find that people with previous craft experience started out much better at stone tool making, and that this was reflected in their neural structure. But yeah, right now we still don't know whether they were kind of born with that tendency or developed it through their craft work or what. So we're early days, but we want to understand where that differential aptitude is coming from. Yeah, when again, I don't have data to tell you, because we don't track people. My sense is, that the stone tool making is a little bit like, something like riding a bicycle, where, yeah, if you haven't done it in 20 years, you better, ride around the driveway a few times before you head out into traffic or something like that, but you will, we will kind of get it back. And we did, the only thing that we have sort of, empirically on that is we did a study some years ago in which people were training in a less controlled way. Like Bruce Bradley actually took them to these, napping field schools, and they would practice for 3 days, 8 hours a day or something like that. And we had, one scan that was taken right after they came back, and it showed big changes in the white matter that I was talking about, and then it went away by the end of the study. And we're still not entirely. I think it was a transient effect of the clustered practice that was good. So that was kind of a use it or lose it thing in terms of the brain structure. Now, whether that means that they also lost skill, or whether that's just something you need to do while you're learning, but not for continued performance, is also not entirely clear from the data that we currently have. But I think sort of, anecdotally, that you need to freshen up a little bit. And then, so again, we don't really know a lot about this. In terms of, so people who study human evolution are sort of fond of these, null hypotheses. They call it that you have to absolutely show that something is essential in order to infer that it was actually present in the past. And so we can't even infer that any instruction or experience at all is essential to learning these things. There's this guy, Eric Callahan, who was one of the early American flint knappers, and he basically learned most of it on his own. There wasn't any, social structure. He didn't know anybody. He just was interested in arrowheads, they found. And he basically reversed it, but it took him decades to learn some techniques that we can teach people now, so it's not impossible. But we don't have a good handle on, for instance, people at the stage they were at, leaving our study, what they still needed in terms of instruction versus just a lot more practice. Yeah, we don't know, but certainly they could get a lot better, I think, if they were to just keep practicing, especially if they did it with each other. I think that would be very helpful. But that gets to another sort of constraint, it's present also in prehistory, is just you need a lot of rock, for this. Like, the people aren't, that's one of the big constraints in designing these studies, is we have to, buy tons and tons of only particular kinds of rock are good for this. And obviously that's, a particularly onerous when you're like in an urban university, but even in the past, you might have to travel and move large amounts of rock. So it's not, so it's costly to learn, I guess, in a lot of different ways.
Costly also because of the time investment. And again, it's, somebody who spends a decade learning something, for its own sake or whatever. I mean, that's raises other issues about other psychological characteristics and social position and so on that make such a thing possible. So I think that's quite interesting. Yeah, there's another comment. I thought I heard someone. And so the question is, what kind of learning is involved in developing a high amount of technical skill, with very precise movements and so on, in a socially prescribed way, and what pedagogical techniques are using? Can we learn something from going out and looking at those kinds of learning in dance and in music and in other areas where there's very high levels of refinement and precision expected from people? And how is that taught? I mean, are there lessons to be learned from that, compared to this kind of technology?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think I'm going to get myself in trouble very rapidly if I start talking about musical performance and dance, which I don't do, and saying like, oh, this takes this, takes that. But one of the distinctions I was trying to make with the idea of the technology is that you're trying to, alter physical objects in the world and like that kind of thing. And this is a distinction that other people have made, between sort of instrumental or physically instrumental things and ritual stuff. And the way, so like something like dance, and it's harder for me with the music, is what's important in for religious rituals is to reproduce the movement. The movement, the form of the movement is important. And so that is, all this imitation stuff, precise. Whereas with the stone toolmaking, actually, if you reproduce the form of the movements, it would be a disaster, because like every rock is different. So what you actually have to learn is something about, your relationship with the rock and how what you do corresponds to how it changes, and across different circumstances. So that's why I would say you have to learn this sort of structure of interacting variables, which is very different than trying to reproduce a specific movement. Now, when it gets to the sort of the more expressive aspects of music and dance is where I'm not quite sure how that fits into the other than that you have to have really mastered the motions in order to be engaging your attention at a higher level. It's something about the way that it's conveying information.
Yeah, and that higher level could have components of what you're talking about, where you have to do it differently in this situation now, because let's say you're improvising with a group or something, and you're what you're doing is built out of these mimetic components, but what you're actually doing now is learning how to be appropriately responsive to a particular configuration. So, but anyway, this is getting pretty abstract and pretty all-inclusive of human, the most complex human cognition. So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I missed a chunk of that. I just had a little internet blip there while you were talking.
Well, I was just saying that what you said, that there may be an analogy to the kind of learning to respond and or adjust what you're doing to a configuration in something like improvisation within a group, where your actions are built up out of these smaller mimetic components. You know how to do all these things precisely, but now the real task is to use those to respond appropriately to the particular configuration that's in front of you. But then I sort of qualify with saying, once you get to this level of abstract describing things, we've pretty much included all of complex human cognition at that point. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a really interesting metaphor, and people like nappers have talked about sort of the dialogue with the stone, right? That you're like, but then the question, well, is that just a metaphor, or is it actually kind of similar? Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's this level in which both of them are probably involved in these sort of predictive internal models, but if the nature of the model becomes very different, you're talking about different neural systems and different, then, again, that's something that could be probed, a lot more, I think.
Yeah.
But people have actually focused, the neuroscientists have focused more on things like dance and musical performance because they're actually perceived to be easier to operationalize in the lab, than, I mean, stone toolmaking involves, creates so much, there's a sense in which at least a certain kind of, experimental musical performance could, say it has to be uniform and same all the time, which they love. Whereas the stone toolmaking is so many variables, but probably real dance in the real world is probably more like that. So.
Yeah. Great. Any last questions or comments? I think this has been really stimulating, and I mean, again, it's beautiful work, and it's it's both a microcosm of certain building blocks of human cognition, and of course, this essential chapter in in the longue durée and in the deep history of human society. So it's very, very important to us. And this general issue of know-how versus knowing that. There's a book by Francesco Varela, an old book, talking about morality from that point of view, and saying what we really mean by moral knowledge is not principles that we adhere to, but appropriate ways of acting in certain situations. And again, what's the relationship between that person who's morally skilled and appropriate, and what we then codify and try to talk about in a more explicit way. So just to say that the same conundrums that exist in this, if I can call it a microcosm in any event, play out on so many other levels in different domains. So I find this incredibly stimulating.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I'm always trying to push the concept of skill into every nook and cranny of human behavior. So, it's been a lot of fun. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.